Hello, and welcome to the webinar titled The Future of DACA. My name is Ignacia Rodriguez-Cametz, Immigration Policy Advocate at the National Immigration Law Center, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. On Friday, June 28th, the U.S. Supreme Court announced it would hear 3 cases challenging the termination of the DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. The purpose of this webinar is to get an understanding of what this means and to understand what's happening in the courts, in Congress, and in the field. I am grateful to be joined by my amazing colleagues today. In front of you is an agenda listing what each presenter will cover. Mayra Joaquin, staff attorney at NILC, will share developments in the DACA and in the Supreme Court. Diana Pliego, policy associate at NILC, will share developments in Congress, particularly on H.R. 6 and Appropriations. Lastly, we will hear from Juan Manuel Guzman, Advocacy and Policy Manager at United We Dream. At the end, we will have time for Q&A, and we will share a list of resources with you all. If you wish to ask a question, please use the questions box located on the right-hand side of your screen to enter your question at any time. Before I turn it over to our panelists, I do want to note that this webinar is being recorded and you will receive a copy of the recording and slides via email. You can also find this information on our website at nilc.org. With that, I'll turn it over to our first presenter, Mayra Joaquin.
Hi, everyone. First, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
So hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. As Ignacia mentioned earlier, I'm Mayra Joaquin, and I'm a staff attorney at the National Immigration Law Center, and I'm also an attorney on the Batalla Vidal lawsuits, one of the cases that we will talk about today. Can you please switch to the next slide? Thank you. So I do want to start with some background just to highlight the significance of last Friday's news. After the Trump administration ended DACA back in September 5th, 2017, there were several cases that were filed that challenged the government's decision to end DACA. These cases argued that the decision to end DACA violated the Administrative Procedure Act because the government's decision was arbitrary and capricious, and also because the government's decision to end DACA violated the Constitution's guarantee of equal protection because it discriminated against Latinos. As a result of these lawsuits, several district courts, including the district court here in California and UC Regents versus Department of Homeland Security, as well as the district court in New York in Batalla Vidal versus Nielsen, and a district court in DC and NAACP versus Trump, all concluded that the government's decision to end DACA was unlawful. 2 of these courts, the courts in California and New York, issued orders that required the government to continue processing DACA renewal applications for anyone who has or has previously had DACA. As a result of these rulings and the injunctions that were then created, thousands of DACA recipients have been able to continue applying for a DACA renewal after the government ended DACA on September 5th, 2017. The government moved on to appeal those cases, and they were all on appeal at the 9th Circuit, the 2nd Circuit, and the DC Circuit. However, while those cases were on appeal, in November of 2018, the government took the rare step of asking the Supreme Court for certiorari before judgment, which means they asked the Supreme Court to review those decisions by the lower courts before there was even a decision on those cases by the Courts of Appeal. Between November of 2018, which is when the government moved to ask for the Supreme Court's review, through early June, the Supreme Court had taken no action on any of those pending petitions. Last Friday, on June 28th, the Supreme Court granted the government's request to hear the 3 cases, which have been pending before it now for several months. The cases in Regents, which is the California case, the Batalla Vidal lawsuit in New York, and the NAACP case in DC. Because the 9th Circuit Court of Appeals has been the only case to have issued a decision in Regents, the government went ahead and modified its request before the Supreme Court last year. And so that right now is the only case before the Supreme Court where the court will also consider the decision by a court of appeals. Last Friday, we learned that in addition to granting those 3 cases, it consolidated the cases, meaning that all 3 cases will be reviewed and heard jointly. And the court has now scheduled them for a 1-hour oral argument. Next slide, please. So what does this mean? As of now, the court has not set a date yet for the oral argument. What we do know is that the Supreme Court will likely hear these cases either late this year or early 2020. We expect a decision from the Supreme Court on whether the government's decision to end DACA was unlawful by June of 2020. And I think it's critical to remember that even while these cases are being reviewed by the court, the injunctions that were issued by the district courts do remain in place. And as a result of those orders, anyone who has or has previously had DACA can continue to apply for renewal. As such, you should all encourage anyone who has or has previously had DACA to go ahead and submit a renewal application and to consult with an immigration attorney before they do that to ensure that the applications are filed correctly and to ensure that there's no other issues with their applications. The last item that I want to flag is just a quick note because there is an additional case, the DACA, the Maryland case, that has been challenging the government's decision to end DACA. The government has also asked the Supreme Court to review that case, but the briefing for that request was different than the timeline for the other 3 cases, and so the briefing was not completed until late June. As of right now, the Supreme Court has not taken any action on that request. So for now, the DACA, the Maryland case remains pending before the Supreme Court, and it is not one of the DACA termination cases that was consolidated and for which there's expected to be, well, there will be oral arguments soon. And that's all I will say for now, but I'm sure several people will have questions that I can answer at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Myra. Now we'll hear from Diana Pliego.
Wonderful, thank you so much. So if we can go on to the next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit about a bill that I think most people have heard some things about. It's called HR 6, the Dream and Promise Act. It's a bill that we have been fighting for a while now to get passed through Congress. And it's a bill that would provide permanent protections and a pathway to citizenship for some key communities that we've been working for and with immigrant youth, and that includes recipients of the DACA program. And it also would provide protections for people with temporary protected status and deferred and forced departure. All of these communities, as you are all well aware, have many have been here for decades in this country. They call this country home, and so the passage of this bill in the House of Representatives recently was a huge win for the communities that have been fighting for protections for such a long time now. And I just want to acknowledge that this bill, while it's not perfect, it does have a lot of great provisions that we have not seen before in previous iterations of the DREAM Act. And so I invite you to definitely check out our NOC resources. There's a quick 2-page summary that really boldly highlights, what are the positives and what are the kind of downsides of the things in this bill. I invite you to take a look at that. That was created in partnership with United Agreement on DACA Block. And we just wanted to make it clear that, while this bill was certainly not perfect, it is certainly a bill that we have been fighting for a long time, and that would really put us in a much better place, and it's a huge step forward in gaining protections for this community. And so we were really excited when just this past month it passed the House of Representatives, and it was also passed in a way where there were no amendments by those trying to make the bill worse. And we are really excited to see where this bill can take us. I know the big question now is that, where does this bill go in the Senate? And I think the reality here is that, the path in the Senate is a little bit unclear. We have a Senate leadership that is currently refusing to bring this bill up for a vote. And we also have to acknowledge that we are still currently under an administration that doesn't want to see protections passed for people without doing it in exchange for either money for a wall or other items on their anti-immigrant wish list that would harm people and harm the same people that we're trying to fight these protections for, right? And so I think because of those two things that are kind of happening in the Senate and in the grand scheme of things, we have to just realize that, the pathway is uncertain, but we still think that this is a bill that we need to continue pushing forward, and we need to continue putting pressure on members of Congress to provide protections for our communities, for immigrant youth, DACA and TPS holders, without also hurting our communities. And so I want to, if we could go on to the next slide, please. And so appropriations, you must be wondering, why are we talking about appropriations when we're here to talk about DACA and the DREAM Act and protections for our people, right? Well, I think it's really important to highlight that while we continue this fight for DACA, TPS, and DED holders and the larger community, we need to recognize that there's still so many attacks that are happening on our community. There's tragedies happening at our southern border. We have threats of raids constantly. And so in recognizing that we're being attacked on many different fronts, we and many of our partners, United with Dream being on this call, we have recognized that because of these attacks, there is a way for us to have a really immediate and tangible effect on the impact on our communities. And the way to do that is to cut off the resources that this administration is giving its agencies to inflict harm on our communities. And so that's why we are part of a coalition that's called Defund Hate. And the mission there is to decrease funding to ICE and CBP and instead invest in other programs that really strengthen our communities. And so we really invite you to join us in this fight to defund hate, and that while our members of Congress are pushing for these protections for our people, that we also be calling on them to reduce the funding given to ICE and CBP so that they don't continue harming our communities. And so just to go over some quick things that have happened very recently, you may have heard that there was this thing called an emergency border supplemental that was requested to provide funding for CBP at our border, for ICE and CBP at our border, to essentially, the idea is to provide humanitarian aid, but the reality is that this supplemental held a lot of really problematic and harmful things for our community, including, as you can see here, $209 million for ICE, more than $1 billion for CBP, and there's money going directly towards the building and operating of jails that are most likely going to be something like tent camps. In addition, we want to make sure that when we're calling on members of Congress to reduce the money given to ICE and CBP, that we're also, whatever money is given to them is done with restrictions and increased oversight and accountability. And a big problem with this supplemental that just passed is that it did have some accountability, but then in that same bill later on, there were provisions that undermined those efforts. And just in short summary is basically that we were trying to get them to limit the transfer of funds within DHS. For example, we know that they used to take money from FEMA in the past, and that they were using that money to detain people. And so we want to prohibit that, but then this bill, what it did is it later undermined that by saying, well, they're allowed to redirect people that are not meant for detention and enforcement efforts into those efforts. And so we want to make sure that we're passing bills that provide really strict accountability and oversight for these agencies that are causing this much harm. Next slide, please. And so I think this really just brings us into what is a current and ongoing fight, right? I say current and ongoing because it's something that happens every single year. If Congress does anything every year, it has to pass the budget. And where we care about is that Department of Homeland Security budget that is governing the ICE and CBP budgets, right? And so what recently happened was that the House Appropriations Committee marked up and passed their DHS bill, which had a lot of really great improvements. Among those improvements was an amendment to defund this public charge rule, Muslim ban rule, asylum ban. It did provide cuts to ICE detention, but overall, once you add up all of the money, there was still overall increase for ICE. And so we still need to continue calling on our members of Congress to reduce the funding that would go to ICE because they have so much authority to redistribute that in ways that are really harmful to our community. And so the key moments to look out for, I wish I had dates for you, but unfortunately there's no set date right now for the House vote to vote on this DHS bill that was brought out of the Appropriations Committee. And there hasn't been any date also set for any kind of movement in the Senate on their own DHS bill. But what we do know is that the fiscal year ends on September 30th, which means that before then, they have to pass the big budget that includes the DHS bill and many other bills, but they do have to get that done before then. And so just to be on the lookout, subscribe to our email alerts, and we can tell you just exactly how you can get plugged in when these fights are happening. And I will pass the mic back over to Ignacio.
Thank you, Diana. And just as a reminder, if you wish to ask a question, please use the questions box located on the right-hand side of your screen to enter your question at any time. So lastly, we'll hear from Juan Manuel Guzman. Juan?
Hi, everyone. Hey, thank you so much. So if we can, before we talk about like the field response, we wanted to provide you with a refresher again, like of what we have been going through right now, in terms of what has happened and what it is that we need to do. As you heard from Myra last Friday, the Supreme Court announced that it is going to hear the arguments for and against the DACA case, but we have to be clear what this means for people, especially for immigrant youth who have a lot of stakes here. First thing, there's no changes to DACA as of now. This means also that there is no new applications. New applications are not being accepted. Advanced parole is not there, but DACA renewals are a thing. DACA renewals are still being accepted, and this is the main issue. One of the main driving pieces that we want to get across is that DACA renewals are still being accepted. Can we go to the next slide, please? So again, arguments we heard from Myra, we can probably going to start seeing the arguments or the hearings happening late fall. Probably a decision might come next year. We don't know we don't have a date. It could be any time between January or June of 2020. We do not know how this is going to, which direction this is going to go, but one of the things that we are seeing is of course that it is going to be right in the middle of a presidential elections, and it's going to have an effect on how the debate on immigration is being discussed. Can we go to the next one? So what it is that we are asking everyone right now is that one, please, 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 if you have DACA recipient members in your organization, or you work with DACA recipients, or you have family members, please share the following information. One, go to renewmydaca.com. You will find all the information that you need in terms of like how do you renew your DACA, like what are the key things to keep in mind when you are renewing your DACA, and any questions that people might have. So the first thing is that people need to be informed about what's happening with the DACA case and with the DACA program. The second thing is that we're asking people to contribute to the DACA renewal fund. As many of you know, the DACA program is quite expensive, and it can be a toll for a family that also has probably multiple DACA recipients in their house. But it's $495, almost $500 that comes out of the pocket of our families. So we're asking everyone, please go ahead, share these resources. If you can contribute to the DACA renewal fund. This is something that we really need people to do. We are also encouraging people to please be informed. We have been hearing a lot of threats from the administration in terms of like having raids and detaining and putting people in detention. So we're also trying to keep people informed of what these things can mean for immigrant communities. Um, Lastly, one last thing that I would say is that please, if you can, share all the resources that we have been sharing with Milk. Um, United We Dream is also publishing a lot of things on our social media accounts. So please, please, please help us disseminate this information. One last thing also, there is actions happening this week that United We Dream is also supporting. This is in regards, or this is related to the child detention facilities, and that, as probably many of you have seen, there is a lot of really horrible pieces of information coming out of these detention facilities. Support, share of all of those pieces, those actions that are happening, the news, and everything. And if you have any questions, please, please, please do not hesitate to reach out to Milk or United We Dream. With that, I will pass the mic back to Ignacio.
Thank you so much, Juan Manuel. And as a reminder, if you wish to ask a question, please use the questions box on the right-hand side of the screen. It's not too late to pose a question. In front of you is a list of resources that are available if you want to learn more. So the first item is an alert. It explains what happened at the Supreme Court level and also provides a background on the 3 cases that we're describing. The next document, Top 5 Things to Know About DACA Renewals. That document was co-created by United We Dream and NILC, and that has specific guidance for DACA recipients. So we encourage you to check that out, and we do have a Spanish version available also on our website. And lastly, we do have a document that we update periodically, which showcases all of the litigation involving DACA. And so if you wish to know where certain cases are, including cases that we have not covered here during this call or are not going before the Supreme Court but want to know its progress, feel free to check out that document which covers that information. So with that, we'll begin the Q&A portion of the webinar. And so there's some clarifying questions for Myra, starting with, could you go over once again the timeline for when the Supreme Court may be able to hear this case?
Certainly. So as I mentioned earlier, we do not have a date yet for the oral argument. With that said, the court does start session again in October, and so the oral argument can be any time late this year, or it can even be early 2020. We will have a date soon, and as Ignacio mentioned, we do have several resources, so the moment that we find out of the date for the oral argument, we will be updating our resources so that everyone is up to date on of the precise date for the oral argument. And we will expect to receive a decision from the Supreme Court by June of 2020.
Okay, great. And Myra, if we want to track the case, what is the name of the case?
Yes, so there's actually 3 different cases that are at play. One of the cases is Kevin McAleenan versus Batalla Vidal. The other cases is Department of Homeland Security versus UC Regents of California. And then the third case is Trump versus NAACP. And you can actually track them on the SCOTUS blog or through our resources. What we can do is because I believe we're sending the link to this webinar as well as additional resources, we can go ahead and include the links to each of those cases on the Supreme Court website so that you can also follow along if you'd like at the Supreme Court site.
Okay, great. And Myra, the Supreme Court case is just regarding the preliminary injunction, not the rescission on its merits. Is that right? There's
several questions before the court. So to backtrack a little, as of right now, the cases that are before the court are asking the court to answer a few different questions. One is whether these cases are reviewable, whether the courts have legal authority to review the government's decision to end DACA. So that's one of the first questions that the Supreme Court will answer. And then second, there's also 2 other questions that go towards the merits, which is, did the government was the government's decision to end DACA likely arbitrary and capricious in violation of the Administrative and Procedure Act? And second, was the government's decision to end DACA actually pled in a way to show that the government's decision was discriminatory against Latinos? This is because when the government asked for the Supreme Court to review, the government is asking for the Supreme Court to review the decision that was issued by the Ninth Circuit and Regents. So that was a decision that affirmed the district court's injunction. And separately, the Supreme Court will also be reviewing the court orders that were issued in Batalla Vidal in New York, as well as in NAACP in DC. So there are these more substantive questions that are at play and which the Supreme Court will be deciding.
Thank you, Myra. Diana, regarding H.R. 6, does H.R. 6 provide lawful status for close family members?
Yeah, so H.R. 6 is really only intended for the people who fall into the category of of immigrant youth and those who have TPS or DED holders, and it moves them into either conditional permanent residence or legal permanent residence, but it does not provide any direct relief for family members who don't fall into those age eligibility or other requirements.
Okay, great. And so this question is quite open. Diana, Juan Manuel, you can choose to answer. What kind of contingencies do you recommend for DACA recipients to have as they prepare in this kind of limbo? Are there grassroots groups that they can join to actually find support?
Juan Manuel, feel free to go first, or I can start.
Go ahead, Diana.
Okay, perfect. Well, I definitely recommend, I think, just that our partners are here, looking for online to see if there is some sort of like an organization that is local to you that's a member of United We Dream, or really any other local immigrant rights group that is working in your area. I think it's really important right now to be surrounded by people who can provide you with resources, not just, with the knowledge about what is happening and what is not, but who can also empower you to take action in the ways that you can, whether locally or part of like a national movement, because it's really important that we fight back, but also just important that we have that support of people who are like-minded and going through these things with us. It's going to be really important to to stay strong and continue this fight until we win.
Thank you, Diana. Another question that came in is, how early can we renew our DACA?
So I can answer that question. So whenever DACA applications are being reviewed and processed, if USCIS approves the DACA renewal application, then they will grant the request for a period of 2 years from the date in which the application was approved. So for example, if an application is being approved tomorrow, then it would be valid from 2 years from tomorrow. So if anyone has recently renewed their application, then submitting that renewal application will likely only extend your DACA application for only a short time frame. I think what's really important to remember is that if you're considering whether to renew your application, you should always be consulting with an immigration attorney when you're making that decision, so that you can see whether renewal is right for you at this time, and so that you can think through the different factors that come into play when you're making that decision.
Thank you. And a similar question, do you recommend that people file a DACA renewal on the date of oral argument at the Supreme Court, just in case there's a loss?
So I think it's really difficult to predict how the Supreme Court will decide. I do believe that we have strong arguments for why the government, when they ended DACA, They did so in a way that was unlawful. And I think if we look at the recent census decision, that shows that the Supreme Court will obviously, there will be instances where the court will recognize exactly the evidence that is before it. And sometimes even when people predict that there may not be a good outcome, there is indeed a good outcome. So I wouldn't necessarily say that you should rush on the day of the oral argument. I think there's several considerations that people must keep in mind when deciding whether to renew and at what point to renew. So I think you should always be consulting with an immigration attorney at that moment to make that decision.
Thank you. Given that there's so much going on, how can we learn about like protests, rallies, special events that are focusing on DACA, the defund hate? How can people get involved?
I would encourage people to follow like NILC, follow United We Dream. We will be sharing a lot of resources and like we will letting people know where there's going to be actions. As I shared before, for example, for this week, where there is going to be several actions as members of Congress are going to. This is more related to the separation and mistreatment of children, but through our social media accounts, we're sharing those resources, those tools. So I would encourage everyone to keep following those social media resources to see when actions might take place. Also, we are planning one, but we have to hash out some details. So I would say just keep an eye on those and let's like let us know if you have any questions. You can also like email us directly, and we will let you know or direct you to places or like dates that we're planning actions or activities in the coming weeks.
Great, thank you, Juan Manuel. And Juan Manuel, can you, it seems like some people may have missed it, can you tell us what financial assistance is available for people who can't pay the DACA renewal fee?
Yes. So we are trying to raise funds to cover the fee, the application fee, which, as I shared before, is almost $500. Is $495. Is very expensive, and it does have a toll in the economy of the families, of immigrant families. So as a result, we have we, along other partners, have been launching this website. There's a website called, let me see if I can get you the exact, like DACArenewals.com. Sorry, let me see. Yeah, so if you go into United with Dreams website, you will see it immediately, but please help us disseminate that. You can donate there, whatever it is that you can, and you can also encourage your family members, your friends, your networks to contribute to the DACA Renewal Fund.
Great. A similar question to the one before, but Juan, maybe you have other thoughts on this too. Should people renew their DACA at the 150-day mark, which used to be the guideline, or can they go ahead and apply for renewal before then?
Yes. Sorry, just wanted to give the exact website is DACArenewalfund.com to contribute to the donations towards the application fees. To answer your question on whether or not people can renew before, we heard that they can do, like the USCIS is accepting applications. I think Mayra pointed that out, and yes, we're telling people if your DACA expires, say in all of 2020, you should renew your DACA. I think the most important thing is that we just want people to be informed and to be aware that we do not know when a ruling can come. So we just want people to renew their DACAs. So I don't know if that answered the question.
Yes, thank you. So Diana, you mentioned earlier that HR 6 benefits the applicant, not the family members immediately. So does that mean that there's a chance of family separation, that the applicant may be separated from their family members?
I think this question really, in my mind, really brings us back to the work that we're doing around appropriations and defunding hate. Obviously, when people are part of mixed status families, say there's a child who's documented and a parent who has no status, any person without status is really kind of at risk, right? And especially under this administration. And so there's always, I think, a risk there that I think everyone kind of like is understanding of, but I think that's why that doesn't mean that people will automatically be separated in any way, shape, or form, but that's why we have to work to fight against these agencies that are being given more money to kind of go and be a threat to our communities. And so we have to kind of continue fighting for protections that go beyond just those for DACA recipients, immigrant youth, TPS and DAD holders. We have to continue fighting for protections for our entire community.
Thank you, Diana. And then in regards to the appropriations fight, someone heard that the appropriations bill extends the time that an unaccompanied child can be held. Is that right? Can you provide more information on that or lead us to a resource that can tell us more?
Yeah, I think they're probably thinking of another bill that was moving forward that was introduced by Senator Graham, and it's an asylum bill. And there's many efforts, I think, legislatively and otherwise, that we're trying to kind of reduce the protections on children that are being detained. That I'm aware of. There's nothing right now in this bill that would do that, but there is funding that is going towards the detention of children, and that's still something that we have a big problem with. And so this is why it's really important to be calling members of Congress and letting them know that you don't support the detention or jailing of children in any way, shape, or form. They should not be in these facilities. They're not meant for them, and they should be allowed to be in their communities and reporting back for their before a judge when they need to, but they should not be held in these conditions.
Okay, great, thank you. And then Myra, a question came in. If we win at the Supreme Court, will advanced parole come back? Will people who have never had DACA before be able to apply if they're eligible?
Unfortunately, the only questions that are before the Supreme Court are around the court orders that are actually in place. So the court orders that are in place do allow anyone who has previously had DACA to continue to apply for renewal, but they do not extend to anyone who has not had DACA before or to allow for advanced parole under the orders. So any decision that could come out from the Supreme Court would only extend to DACA renewals, but it wouldn't. I think there might be questions at play that can be considered for the advanced parole or for first-time applicants, but the decision itself wouldn't apply to anyone in those categories. So even once we hear from the Supreme Court or before then, there are no changes to people who are in either of those circumstances.
Thank you, Myra. So the DACA Renewal Fund is how we give money, and then how do folks actually go about applying for those funds, Juan Manuel?
Yes, so once they enter once they go into renewmydaca.com in the United We Dream website, they will see, they will get a link in which they can be redirected towards the form. They fill out a form, and once the form is submitted, we will be reaching out back. So one of the things though is that, as I said, we need the contributions of everyone who can chip in right now, because the last time I checked, I believe the waiting list was about 300 people. So that is why we're pushing for the DACA renewal fund. And as much as we can, raise those funds, we start notifying people, and then they can get the support for their DACA renewal fee application.
Thank you, Juan Manuel. And so our final question is for Myra. Basically, what is the worst case scenario of what could happen to DACA if it goes to the Supreme Court? Let's say there's a favorable decision supporting the government's position on this program. Would the program abruptly end? Any thoughts on that? Myra, so the question is, oh, I'm sorry, you need a second. So Myra's in the process of unmuting. So as a reminder, the question is, how would a Supreme Court decision in favor of the federal government affect the DACA program at large? And it seems that Myra may have gotten disconnected.
Hello? Sorry.
Hi, perfect timing.
Sorry, I had trouble unmuting myself. So I'm hoping that this works.
Yes.
Favorable and unfavorable. And I'm actually glad that this is the last question, because I do want to go back to the previous question you asked me, Ignacia. And so in a favorable scenario, it does depend on what the Supreme Court says in the end. But if in the end they say that the decision to end DACA was unlawful, and the government memorandum to terminate the program is set aside, in the event that we were in that scenario, then that would actually set aside the entire memorandum from the government. So that would extend past individuals who have renewals, who are currently protected under the orders, and it would also extend to people who would be first-time applicants, or individuals who would have advanced parole. So if we were in the most favorable scenario, I think we would have much more opportunities to continue seeing whether people who have never had DACA or who are interested in having advanced parole can apply for those processes. Now, in the worst scenario possible, in the event that the Supreme Court were to agree with the government that they had the authority to end the program and the decision to end it was not unlawful, then that would mean that the government's decision to end DACA would remain in place. And it's expected that those individuals who do have DACA for the time being would be allowed to continue having their DACA until their DACA expires.
Thank you, Myra. Well, that concludes our webinar. In front of you, you'll see my contact information. So if we didn't get to your question, or if you think of a question later on, feel free to email me directly, and I can connect you to the proper presenter to help answer your question. Thank you to all of our presenters, and thank you all for joining this webinar. Have a great day.